Our next speaker is a freelance game design consultant based in Los Angeles. At his company Game on the Rails, he advises worldwide clients on pitching, prototyping, design, narrative, and production. He specializes in creative problem-solving, helping teams ship their games under tight time or budget pressure. He was involved in such names as Fat Princess, Warhawk, Sorcery, Everybody Has Gone to the Rapture, Bound, and Hear the Lie. He was also the lead designer of Rainbow Six and Ghost Recon. Let's put our hands together for Mr. Brian Upton. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here. As I mentioned, I've been in the game industry for about 20 years. A lot of that was at Sony Santa Monica, where I supervised weird experimental titles. And while I was there, I sort of developed a collection of design methodologies for dealing with non-standard games with non-standard mechanics. And that's what I'll be talking about today. The title of the talk is Designing Non-Interactive Play. And let me explain a little bit what I mean by that. So non-interactive play, it's a weird term. We think that interactivity is so central to what games are. But I think the fact that we treat interactivity as central to games is more of a historical accident than something that really says something essential about games. And I'll give you a little bit of background for why I think this came about. We have two images here. On one side we have Aristotle, on the other side we have the royal game of Ur. And for me these represent two different threads of very old traditions. Aristotle was one of the first people to think critically about what stories are and what constitutes a story, and the royal game of Ur is one of the oldest games we know about. It dates to 2600 BC, and it was played, as far as you know, continuously in various forms up until the 19th century as part of an ongoing tradition. It's a very, very old game, but also a very popular one. And I've actually played it. It's still pretty good. It has a cameo in Uncharted 3 if you played it. But what's interesting about these two different traditions, the literary tradition that's associated with that began with Aristotle and the royal game of Ur, is the way that they developed within Western culture. So on one side we have a page from a 10th century copy of Aristotle's Poetics. And on the other side, this is the actual rules to the royal game of Ur that were written down by a Babylonian astronomer in 177 BC. It also includes some commentary of his about how you should play. And what's interesting about these two documents, even though they're relatively contemporary with each other when they were written. Aristotle was writing in the 4th century BC, Ur was being played at that point, is that they're approached very differently in terms of what's written down about them. Aristotle didn't write about one piece of literature. He didn't write about sort of how to read a particular, or how to attend a particular play, or how to read a particular work. He wrote about literature in general. He developed a general theory of what literature was and how it operated with an audience, and how, if you wanted to create a play or a story, how it should work. A general overall theory of what literature was. Whereas games, even though games are just as old or even older, all we have are rules or commentary on how to play specific games. Until very, very recently, there was no general theory of game design. Nothing about what is a game in general, how should we go about designing games, how should we go about critiquing games or enjoying games. It was all focused on very specific individual games. And the difference between these two critical traditions was very, very important. When we actually get to the 1980s and the 1990s, when it becomes profitable to make a lot of games. So we wind up, and this is the source of the narratology versus ludology debate, if you've heard about it. And the question is, if we're making a lot of games, and there's a lot of money to be made in games, the way it happened with the video game explosion, then it's very important to know how to make games correctly. All of a sudden it becomes an interesting question to ask, what is a good game? What constitutes a good game? How should games properly be played? The answer to that question, you could either start from scratch and say, well, we don't have a critical theory of what games are, but we can start and begin to build one. And a lot of people did that starting in the 1990s, and those are the ludologists. And for a ludologist, what a game was a system. A game was a piece of machinery like a clock, and it worked in certain ways, and it had certain affordances, and it had certain restrictions. And this little piece of clockwork was fun to engage with. And so, from a ludological perspective, a game was a piece of machinery. But the narratologist said, well, we already have 3,000 years of literary criticism. And if games are works of art, maybe we should be using literary criticism to analyze them. And so the narratologist said, let's borrow all this stuff that we've been working on, all this critical theory, these ways of understanding how people go about making meaning, and apply them to games. Well, the ludologists resisted because there's a lot of things that don't work particularly well if you're trying to take literary theory and apply it to gameplay. And it doesn't explain a lot of things that makes games interesting. And so for a while you had a situation that was kind of like this. There's a lot of fighting back and forth. But eventually you wind up with something more like this. There's this sort of agreement that games are a hybrid, that there are story-like elements within games, and that these story-like elements obey the traditional rules that have been developed since Aristotle about how stories work and how you tell stories and what makes characters interesting. And then there are game-like elements within games, and this is the ludology side of it, that you have a machine, a system that is sort of driving these interactions, and that's what makes a game fun. That's what makes a game gamey. And in order to push back against the narratologist, in order to resist this attempt by the literary theorists for colonizing games, it was important to stake out sort of a battleground and say, no, this is why all your literary theory doesn't get to tell us what games are. And one of the key weapons in that was interactivity. By saying games are interactive, we can say, no, everything that you learned in college literature class, that doesn't apply to us because we're new and different, and it's a brave new world, and nothing counts. And so you need to listen to our understanding of games as systems. You can't keep telling us that games need to be read the way you read stories. And as a way to defend games against being colonized by literary theory, interactivity worked really, really well as a tool. But the problem is that instead of just thinking of it as a tool to push back against the narratologists, we came to think that interactivity was what games were, that was somehow fundamental to the essence of games, and that the more interactive a game is, the better it is. And there's a problem with that, and that can be revealed in this. When you see gameplay situations like this, if you play a good game of chess, you may have 2 or 3 minutes, 5 minutes. If you're playing by mail, you may have days where there is no meaningful interaction that's happening. The play of chess happens when you're staring at the board and thinking. The actual interactions in chess are bookkeeping. And so if you want to think about what makes the texture of a game of chess, if you focus only on the moments of interaction, you're missing a lot of the play that's happening. And it turns out that if you look at games, there are a lot of situations in games where interactivity is not that important, that interactivity actually gets in the way of the play experience. So chess is one example. Almost every turn-based game has non-interactive play within it. If you look at puzzle games, a lot of times puzzle games involve sitting and staring and thinking. But it also appears in strategy games. There's a lot of planning involved, a lot of considering what's going to happen next. You see it in horror games. There's very little interactivity in horror games. What makes a horror game engaging and fun and scary is not necessarily what you're doing, but what you think might be happening behind the scenes. And if you take it to extreme, if you look at a game like Dear Esther or Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, the walking simulators of games, clearly there's minimal interactivity here, but there is still a feeling of playfulness that emerges. It turns out that sometimes the most playful thing that a game can do is hold still and not provide opportunities for the players to interact. And it turns out there are actual design principles you can use to design moments of stillness in order to facilitate this kind of non-interactive play. Now, I first became aware that this sort of stuff existed years ago when I was designing the original Rainbow Six. And Rainbow Six, if you haven't played it, it's a shooter, but it's a tactical shooter, and it's very, very lethal. It has one-shot kills. It has a lot of tactical squad-based mechanics where you plan things out. And one of the things that was interesting about it is when we started playtesting levels, some of the most fun moments to play were not when you were shooting. It's when you were sort of standing in a hallway, standing in an empty hallway like this, with its 1990s era graphics, just wondering what you're going to do next. So this, it turns out, is a very powerful gameplay moment in Rainbow Six, even though you're not interacting. And trying to understand why this works as a gameplay moment, why are some hallways interesting to stand in, and other hallways boring to stand in, is an interesting design question, and one that requires a lot of thinking in order to be able to answer. Here's another hallway from a similar, from a more recent game that also relies a lot on non-interactive play. This is from PT. I hope you got a chance to play PT. It was briefly available on the PS4 before it was pulled off. It was the playable trailer for Silent Hills, and what's interesting about it is that there's almost nothing to the level design in PT. The entire game consists of an L-shaped corridor and a bathroom, and that's 90% of the game right there, and you go through it over and over again. Your interactions are very, very minimal. You can open doors, and you can look closely at things. Nevertheless, this manages to be one of the scariest games I've ever played. It is absolutely terrifying to play PT, even though all you're doing is moving around and looking at things. And the reason that it's so scary is because you are actually making moves within PT. It's just that the moves you're making are not expressed in the actual physical world. The important moves you're making in PT are the ones that you're making inside your mind. That there are things that PT does to create situations that you work through in your head in ways that make it so scary. We can think a little bit like playing a game like PT, like reading a book. I mean, a book is interactive. After all, you turn the pages. You're making moves within a book. The book responds when you turn a page by going to the next page. I mean, if you're going to look at that sort of minimal level activity, you can count a book as being interactive, but it's not a meaningful sort of interactivity. And the same thing is true with PT. You're interacting in the sense that you're moving around and looking at things, but the real play occurs entirely inside your head. So I'm going to take a step backwards now. If we're going to understand the way non-interactive play first, let's first talk a little about what play is. And there are lots of different ways to define play. I'm not saying that this is the definitive way to define play, but it's a way that I use to define play because it answers a whole lot of questions that I find particularly useful. I would argue that play is a series of interesting decisions. Play is when a game is something that puts you in situations where over and over again you have interesting choices to make. If you think about a board game, if you think about a video game, if you think about sports, over and over again you're saying, okay, what should I do? What should I do? What should I do? But it also takes place in other spaces that we don't think of quite as much as being normal game spaces. If you're a kid, if you're a child playing make-believe, what do I do? I'm pretending to be a firefighter. What do I do next? What do I do next? What do I do next? That same question of what do you do gets asked over and over again. If you're into improvisational theater, there are theater games that also have this similar sort of sense of I'm making interesting decisions as I move forward. Or if you play a role-playing game like Dungeons & Dragons, there's always these interesting decisions to make. By the way, this is not an interesting decision for reasons I will discuss later. A set of doors like this is a decision to make, but it is not a good one. This is not a good play space. And the distinction between good and bad play spaces, it turns out, is crucial for understanding how non-interactive play works. So in order to set up a situation where we have decisions to make, or good decisions to make, we need to set up constraints. Constraints are things that limit us from doing anything possible in the world. So, if we have no constraints at all, we're not playing because we can do anything. We have too many choices and the play space collapses. The quality of a game is determined by the sort of decisions that its constraints structure. So there are a variety of things that can be constraints. I mean, obviously the rules of a game are constraints. And the rules of a game can be written down. They can be coded into a piece of software. There are hard restrictions on what we can and can't do as we're playing. But there are other constraints besides this. So if you're playing sports are games that use physical things as their constraints. The physical behavior of a soccer pitch or of a soccer ball, the bodies of the human players, these are also constraints. There are things you can and cannot do in soccer, not because the rules forbid it, but because they are physically impossible. You can't jump 20 feet in the air. There doesn't need to be a rule saying you can't jump 20 feet in the air. That's something a human body can't do. And if we go to video games, we can have virtual bodies, and virtual bodies can either mimic real-world bodies or they can be different from real-world bodies. But at the same time, the virtual bodies and virtual spaces impose constraints on what we can and can't do within a game. The level layout of a first-person shooter, for example, is an additional constraint. It's just as constraining as a real-world space in terms of determining whether we can do something or not. But there are also mental constraints. The strategies we develop, our understanding of what the game is, our attitude toward the game, that also determines how we play it. If we think that we're playing a first-person shooter, we will move differently through the space than if we think we're playing a horror game. So our own attitudes towards the game also provide a constraint on what we're doing. So game design itself is about arranging constraints so that they structure playful decisions. That you're creating limitations on what the player can do in ways that make it playful to play. And not just once, but repeatedly, over and over again. You don't just have one good decision, but you have a whole multitude of decisions that happen over again in sequence. But what's important to realize is that these decisions don't necessarily have to change the external state of the game. It is just as interesting to make a decision that changes something in your head as it is to make something that changes something out on the board or in the software. So coming up with a good strategy, coming up with a good plan, that feels playful, even though the only change is inside our head. That aha moment, I've solved it. If you're playing a puzzle game, the puzzle is over when you know the solution, not when you do the interaction out in the world to actually make the change. And so that the change inside our head is actually more important for the feeling of play than the change within the world. So this is from a game called Desert Bus. It's a really, really boring game. I mean, your goal is to keep the bus on the road while you're driving through a desert, and all you have to do is keep going straight for hours and hours. By most objective measures, it's not a good game. There are a lot of situations we encounter where games are, where there are a lot of situations we encounter that have rules or constraints that are boring. If you're waiting in line at some governmental bureaucracy, to say renew your driver's license, there's a lot of constraints that are imposed on you, but it's a very boring situation to be in. So it's not just that there are constraints, not just that there are rules that make something feel playful, but it's how those constraints are arranged. And it turns out that there are a variety of things that the constraints need to provide in order for a situation to feel playful. And I'm going to run through these, and I'm going to talk in particular how they apply to non-interactive play spaces. The 6 things are ambiguity, that you have a range of possible choices you can make, either internal or external. Variety, these choices are always changing. You're always getting new ones. Consequence, you can see what the effects of your choices have effects on the world or have effects inside your head. Predictability, you can tell what those effects are going to be in advance. Uncertainty, but you're not absolutely sure what they will always be. And finally, satisfaction, that they move you toward the choices that you're making move you toward some sort of goal that you're trying to achieve. And I'll talk about all of these in more detail. And this is one reason why the wall of doors is not a very good play space. It certainly gives you a choice, but you have no idea what the consequences are. There's no reason to pick one door over another. You don't have a sense that if you're picking blindly from a set of doors, that you're moving yourself towards winning or you're moving yourself towards losing. It's a completely arbitrary random choice, and so it doesn't feel painful. It doesn't feel playful. It only feels playful if you have a sense that it's moving you towards some place that you want to be. So how does all this apply to non-interactive play? It's obvious how these things could apply to a normal play space where you're making moves. But when we're talking about non-interactive play, what does it mean to make a choice? What sort of situation are we putting the player in where you're making a non-interactive choice? And usually it can be boiled down to a set of questions. What question are we asking the player to answer at any given point? So the simplest question is, what should I do? And this is the easiest to design for. Often designing what should I do moments are really just extensions of normal game design. You're creating a plan, you're giving the player an option to think of a plan to work through, and they're trying to plan out their moves in advance, and you're playing through the actions in your head, and then you then verify that when you actually play the game. So a lot of times the non-interactive play spaces we create are almost invisible, because if we create strategic moments in games where you're asking yourselves, what should I do? Well, that just feels like the normal flow of interactive play. It doesn't feel quite as much as distinct from the others, but it's still a distinct moment. But we also have what's going to happen. And this is the play that you have in horror games. This is anticipation of what's going to happen next. And in this case, you're not so much planning out the moves you're going to make, you're trying to imagine what state the world is going to be in the future. And so this also impacts the way you plan out narratives. Like if you're creating a situation where you want the player to be engaged with a narrative, you often want them wondering, what's going to happen next? What's going on? What's happening here? Trying to understand what's happening is another way to do non-interactive play. And finally, if you're interested in making games that are powerful and deep and like stick with people as artistic works, what does it mean? What message are you taking away from this game? What residue of experience do you have after this is all over? And all of these are different ways to play with games and play non-interactively. So we're going to return to what I talked about, the different ways in which to create situations that are playful, and talk about how these things actually need to be implemented. If you actually want to have experiences like these in the games, what do you need to do to make these particular things happen? So the first, I call this principle 0. If you want to have non-interactive play, you have to give space for it to unfold within. You have to provide stillness for the player. Walking simulators have tons of this. You have lots of stillness in a walking simulator. But even if you don't, if you're designing an action game and you want people to be thinking about strategies and strategizing what to do next, you have to stop the action. You have to create moments of downtime for players to think about what they're going to do next. So a pause in the action where they have sort of a breathing room. If you're constantly having to interact with the game, if the game is constantly making demands on you and things are constantly changing, then it's very difficult to lapse into non-interactive play. Instead, you have to keep interacting, you have to keep servicing the game, and that gets in the way of any sort of non-interactive experience. And that means that it's going to be hard to plan, but more importantly, it's going to be hard to anticipate, and it's also going to be hard to find meaning within a game. You might find something that happens, you may afterwards in the stillness after it's all done, you might analyze it and think, oh, what did that game mean to me? Why did I feel like that? But you won't feel that sense of meaningfulness emerging in the game unless you let the player have the stillness to unfold within. And so the most obvious is have a pause in the action. And this is what we had in the original Rainbow Six when I first noticed this. You'd have places where you were relatively safe and you weren't shooting things. You might be able to hear things happening around you. You knew things were going on, but you could stop and think about what was going on. You could plan ahead. You can anticipate what was going on. And a great way to do this is also to provide what I call vistas and overlooks. So give a players a view of what they're going to see, of the action area they're going to have before they get to it. Give them a place to sort of study what something is. And this doesn't even have to be as obvious as a vista in a 3D game. You could have a platform that's obviously safe in your platformer. So where everything else is going crazy and it's a very complicated level to play through, there's one place you can jump on and just sort of stand still and study everything, providing these safe spots, moments of stillness, moments where the player knows they don't have to interact, so they can allow themselves to lapse into the sort of gameplay. So then to get into the actual heuristics, ambiguity. In order for there to be non-interactive play, there have to be situations where you're not sure. You're not sure what to do next, you're not sure what's going on, and you're not sure what it means. If you want a game to be meaningful, don't tell the player what it means. Give them a situation where they have to figure out what it means. Give them a situation where it's not obvious what the meaning is, where they have to work through it, because that's where you really engage them. So create ambiguities. Within an ambiguity, how many different choices, how many possible options should there be? I used to be very vague about this and say, oh, well, who knows? Now I'm very blunt, 3 to 5 possibilities within your ambiguity. If you have a gameplay choice to be made, give them 3 to 5 options. If they have possible ways to interpret a situation, 3 to 5 options. That seems to be the magic number. There could be more if you have a lot of time to think about them, and fewer if you're under tight time pressure. But the reason the 3 to 5 different possibilities within an ambiguity are about right is because it takes time to consider them. And if you hold still only for a few seconds, you only have a limited amount of time to consider all the different ramifications of the different possibilities you're offering people. And so if you give somebody 20 different ways that something could play out, that takes a lot of time to figure out. There's a lot of time you have to spend holding still to figure out all the different possibilities. And so if if an ambiguity is too wide open, then it just becomes confusing. You're like, I don't know what to do here. I don't know what this means. I have no idea what's going on here because there's too many different possibilities to consider. At the other end, if it's too obvious, if the solution to something is too clear, then we don't get confused, we get bored. If you have one or two choices, if you only have two choices, and one of them is obviously good and the other one's obviously bad, that doesn't feel playful. You're giving the player a choice, you're offering an ambiguity, but it resolves so quickly that there is no play value. The best ambiguities are sort of chewy. It takes some time to work through them. You're not quite sure what the right answer is. You've got to consider a lot of stuff. That's how you create an interesting, playful situation. So when you're talking about non-interactive play, the way this manifests itself, what route should I take? Where should I go? What sequence of moves should I make to solve a puzzle? That's a good ambiguity. For anticipation, what's around the next corner? What's going on here? You can have interpretive ambiguities. This comes into play when you have storytelling games. You meet a character and you're wondering about the relationships between different characters. Did she ever fall in love with? Is she in love with him? How does that affect their relationship? Is somebody on my team a traitor? That might affect how I play things. All these are interesting ambiguities to play through, and they can be situations that are deliberately structured for the player to experience. The next point is variety. These ambiguities are great, and giving a player an ambiguity to consider is interesting. But once we think about an ambiguity, once we come to a resolution for ambiguity, we're like, is somebody in my team a traitor? Yes, I think they are. Once you make that decision, you remember it, and that ambiguity no longer has any play value. So you need to constantly be providing the player with new things to consider. This is one reason why it's so difficult to get much replay value out of puzzle games. Once you have solved a puzzle, if you remember the solution, it's no fun to play through it again. You already know what all the moves are that you should make. Making the moves again is not nearly as entertaining as it was the first time when you did it. So it's not just that you give players choices to make, interpretations to settle on, but that you give them new ones over and over again. And so that there are always different ambiguities to consider, different questions to answer. So this is from Hitman Go. And this, the planning question is solved relatively easily. I mean, the guards move around. Even if you're not moving, the situation changes. And so you always have new little puzzle problems to solve. If the game isn't moving, maybe the player is moving. As the player is moving, they're learning new information. So if I'm walking forward and I turn a corner within a game, that new information I get when I turn a corner gives me new things to think about. New information, new things to consider, new things to plan around. If I hear audio cues, if I'm walking down a corridor and I hear a growl around the corner, all right, that's a gameplay moment. I'm not interacting, but because I hear that growl, I'll probably stop and I'll think and I'll worry, what's around the corner? And once I answer that question, then I'll start moving again. And so thinking about creating situations like that, you're not giving the player just one question to answer, but you're always varying things that keep them off balance so they don't actually know the answer to the question that's currently in front of them. Next is consequences. The choices that you make to resolve these ambiguities have to affect the future within the game. Things need to matter. So if you're wondering, is there a monster around the next corner? That's a really interesting ambiguity to resolve because that affects what's going to happen to you in the future within the game. If instead you're wondering, I wonder if there's moss growing on the wall around the corner. That's not interesting because unless you're playing a very, very detailed sim, whether there's moss or not around the corner, that doesn't matter for what happens in the future in the game. And so the ambiguities that you offer the player need to always have future consequences. And so when I've been talking about things like interpretation, like, is there a traitor on my team? Is this character in love with that other character? Those usually matter because they're going to affect what's going to happen in the future within the game. So when you're thinking about what ambiguities you're structuring, always consider what are the long-term consequences from these? How do they chain together from one thing into another thing? The best is when you can get a situation where answering one question raises more questions. So the question, is there a monster around the corner, is a very, very good ambiguity because then the question is, well, now what do I do about it? You have one ambiguity, by answering it, you have a second one. And a lot of times with puzzle games, you'll see the same sort of thing. You'll see like, oh, if I make this move, well, then it puts the world in this state, and I can make this other move. So chaining ambiguities together from one into another so they all link together creates a much more fruitful field for non-interactive play. In order for this all to work, you need to have predictability. Because it's not enough just for actions to have consequences and for your decisions within an ambiguity to have consequences, but we have to know what those consequences are. So, and part of this is related to the sense that we are able to make either good or bad moves within the game, which I'll get into a little bit more. But, so is there a traitor on my team is an interesting question, because the question of whether there's a traitor or not is good or bad for their overall gameplay experience. If there is a traitor, that's bad. If there's not, there's good. The answer to that question is meaningful, and we know what the effect is likely to be. We know it's not just that it's consequential, but it's consequential in a way that we can predict. So think about having causal relations, questions about things that lead to other things that lead to other things beyond that. And the player's understanding of these causal relations can be things that you teach them. So if you learn how to play within a puzzle game, you learn what all the palette of different objects are in the game, you know how doing one thing will lead to another thing into another thing. But they can also be connected to our sense of the real world. We know how human beings behave. And if a character behaves like a human being, we have a sense of how they're likely to behave in the game, even if that's not an explicit rule in the game. So for example, if I make a noise, I expect that a guard will turn around and look at me. And so I can think, oh, I should need to be really careful here and not make any noises, not necessarily because the game has taught me that, but because I know that the consequences, the predictable consequences of making a noise are alerting guards because I know how human beings work in the real world. But too much predictability is bad. You also need uncertainty. And the reason why you need uncertainty is because if we have situations with ambiguities and we come up in our mind with moves to resolve them, then playing through those ambiguities in the future has lost its play value. We've already exhausted the play value that they had by already thinking through them in our heads. And so you always need to have this sense of like, oh, I think I know what's going on here, but I'm not quite sure. Because if you're sure, then there is no play value and continue to play through what's going to happen next. You know exactly what's going to happen. You've already resolved all those ambiguities. But if you're not sure, if you think, well, I think there's a monster around the corner, but maybe I'm wrong, that sense of uncertainty keeps us off balance. It keeps us continuing to wonder about what's going to happen next. And so this is why so many games have randomness, hidden information, the unpredictable actions of other players. The randomness itself is not inherently fun. What's important about the randomness is that it creates a veil over the future. It prevents us from planning out all our moves in advance, exhausting all our moves through non-interactive play, so that there is no longer any fun to be had when you play through them. And we see this, I mean, there's mechanics for this in real-world games. It's like when a game of chess is obviously over, you say, checkmate. And you can even say, oh, mate in 5 moves, if you're really, really good. And there's no point in playing those moves because the game is over once the outcome is certain. This particular image here I have is from PT, and I think it's really, really interesting. At the end of this level in PT, there are 2 doors. There's the door you can see here, which is closed, and there's another door beyond it. And for a long time, I was studying PT, and I'm like, why are there 2 doors? Why not just one? Why do you have one door that you have to open and then another door behind it? And I finally realized that the first door is there entirely to show you whether or not it's locked. So if you can keep moving forward, the door is open, and if you can't move forward, it's closed. And the reason it's there is so you don't have to walk to go check. That sense of like, oh, I know right now that it's locked, I don't need to walk over there and find out. Because walking over to check something means that your situation doesn't change. There's nothing to play with. There's no ambiguity. All you're doing is going to check a state in the game. You're not planning anything. You want to leave. You're just checking to see if you can. By putting a second door there and closing it, now the check becomes instantaneous, and you don't have to play through something that doesn't have any ambiguity within it. The ambiguity is resolved instantly, and you can move on to the next thing instead of having to take time to figure out if it's locked or not. So in this case, the rule of uncertainty means like don't preemptively exhaust things that would be interesting for players to play through. And finally, satisfaction. Give the players a way to achieve whatever goals that they are interested in achieving. This is kind of interesting because with non-interactive play, the goals we're talking about are often not winning. If you're interacting, a lot of times what you're trying to do is you're trying to put the game in a state where you win. It's like there's some, you're trying to reach the end of the level, you're trying to stay alive, you're trying to get the most points. There's a thing that you're trying to do that constitutes a satisfactory move. Good moves lead you toward winning, bad moves don't. But with non-interactive play, sometimes if we're planning, we're planning to win, but other times there are other things we're trying to satisfy with the mental moves that we're making. And so understanding what these other sources of satisfaction are can help us with understanding how to design non-interactive play. Really quickly, winning. Everybody knows what winning looks like. Yes, it's very satisfying when it happens, but there are other ways to satisfy the player. One of them is coherence. In the United States, there are people who are Civil War reenactors. They like to dress up as the soldiers on both sides of the American Civil War, and you'll go out and spend a weekend role-playing as the two sides. They'll stage battles. They'll decide in advance which side is going to win, and there's no question, there's no competition involved. They're doing it purely for the sense of having the fantasy of recreating it. And so sometimes satisfaction comes from cohering to a role. It's doing things that are right. It is doing it the way you want to do it. This is where the satisfaction of make-believe involves. Or if you played role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons, the sense that you're inhabiting your character, you're doing things the way you should within the world, that's satisfying coherence play. And this can emerge without trying to win. If you're playing a game of Dungeons & Dragons, you may do something that is really, really against, you may do something that gets your character killed, but it feels very appropriate for your character, and so, as a result, it feels like a very satisfying move to make. Oh, yes, yeah. He totally would have done that because it coheres with what you think should happen. You also see it in really hardcore simulations. If you have something that really is like an extremely realistic war game, you may get situations where you lose, but it doesn't really matter because it felt like everything played out the way it should. Yeah, that's totally the way it would happen. Watching your city collapse when you're playing SimCity, it would totally fail that way because it seems to be happening the way it should. All these are ways to play that you can use within non-interactive play spaces. Another objective is expansion, making things more interesting and more playful. We've come up, hard to believe, on the 10th anniversary of Leroy Jenkins. Leroy Jenkins is a great example of expansion play. If you haven't seen it, there was actually it's more than the 10th, it's the 12th anniversary of Leroy Jenkins. There was a raid in World of Warcraft on Upper Blackrock Spire in 2005, and while the team was planning out their attack, Leroy Jenkins charged in, aggroed everything. It was a total raid wipe, but he did it with such style and in such an interesting way that it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to watch. So the motivation of expansion is making moves just for what the hell? Let's mix it up. Let's make things different. Let's explore. Let's find something different. Even if it lets you lose, even if it makes you lose, making a move that broadens what's going on and makes the whole play space more interesting is a thing to do. And this also works within non-interactive play. Stopping and sort of wondering, what are all the possibilities here? How wide open can we make this? Broadening your sense of what is possible within the game is itself an interesting way to play. And finally, there's closure. And this is moving from, it's the opposite of expansion. It's moving towards closed-off situations. This is an image from the end of Civilization. It's really interesting. If you win, I don't remember which civilization this is, but if you win Civilization, usually they give the option of one extra turn. And they give you one extra turn because a lot of times, in addition to the interactive act of trying to win Civilization, you probably had other things you were trying to do. You had other games you were playing in your head, other non-interactive games. And you're no more meaningful moves to make towards winning, but you still have things you want to try to resolve. It's like, I was building this trade route, and I wanted to see if I conquered this one civilization. You have other things that you're playing through in your head in addition to winning, and you want a chance to resolve them. And so, shutting things down, collecting everything there is to collect, coming up with a satisfying resolution to a story, understanding what's going on around you, having a sense of, oh yeah, I know what's going on now. I know why that thing happened back in the first level. Having everything come together and make sense is also a very, very strong motivation. And so letting players play in ways where they can make sense of things, they can account for everything, they can understand what's going on. These are also moments that provide satisfaction within non-interactive play. The final example I'm going to give, this is from Journey, which probably a lot of people have played, and it gives a really interesting use of how you can use stillness and how you can use stillness in a way that interacts with the more interactive play that happens earlier in the game. If you haven't played Journey, Journey is a two-player platformer. You're randomly partnered with other people online, and you learn fairly early on that there's a value towards sticking together within Journey. That if you stand next to the other player, how much hang time you have when you jump is determined by the length of your cape. And as you jump and you sort of float in the air, your cape gradually shortens, and then when you land, it grows back again. You learn that if you stick near the other player, your cape grows back faster. So it's more easy to play. Sticking with the other character means that you can jump more easily, you can get to more places, it's easier to explore. And you pretty quickly internalize the strategy that sticking with somebody else is a good thing to do. But what's interesting about this moment, this is late in the game, and you have things have been getting progressively more grim, and you wind up in this big open snowfield. And there's nothing to jump to, and even if you wanted to jump to at this point, because of the cold, your capes have melted away. You have no reason to try to jump or even to try to recharge your jump. But every time I've played it, people always stick together through this snowfield. You always see people walking side by side through the snowfield because you've internalized that it's a good thing to stick with the other player. But then you hit this situation where there's not much meaningful interaction, and you still stick with the other player. And this is really interesting because it's a moment of stillness, and you get this sense of, well, why am I with this player? What am I doing here? And that sense of, I'm with this other person and I don't know what's going on, and I'm wondering about what's going on, and I wonder about what is my relationship to them. It's the quiet of this snowfield that you're walking through, and the fact that you have this sense you should be with them, and you're not quite sure why you should be with them, but it feels like the right thing to do. It's a very, very powerful emotional moment. And the emotional moment emerges because you're still playing in the snowfield. But what you're playing with is not how to win. What you're playing with is, how do I make sense of this situation that I've been put in? I've been put into a situation where there's an ambiguity. What am I doing here? Why am I with this person? I am standing next to them because I've been trained that that's a good thing to do. And the meaning that most people take out of Journey is heavily influenced by how they play through the non-interactive play of this moment. How do they work through the ambiguities in the space to achieve an understanding of what the game means to them? It's not boring that you're walking through a space where there's not much to do. It's very, very interesting. But what makes it interesting is that you're focused on something other than interacting. That's the end of my talk. Thank you very much. If you want to read more about this, I have written a whole book on it called The Aesthetic of Play. I also did a detailed analysis of how non-interactive play works in levels in this book, Level Design, Processes and Experiences, that was edited by Chris Totten. And if you want to talk to me about it online, I'm available at bbupton on Twitter. You can reach me through email, and also I have a website, since I freelance as a contractor, at gameontherails.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And I think we have like 1 or 2 minutes if there are any quick questions.
Hello, great talk. I wanted to ask you about, do you feel that designing for non-interactive game spaces have a place in free-to-play? Because most likely, if you force player to think rather than act, you risk that he just gets bored or he leaves the game and never return. So do you think that it's even possible to design around that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question because non-interactive play requires a lot more player willingness. It's like if you're always asking the player to do something, then they have the only choice they have non-interactively is to just walk away and say, "I'm done." Whereas there's a greater risk involved to non-interactive play because if you hold still, you're not putting a demand on the player. And as you're right, they can just say, "No, I'm not going to do it." I think within free-to-play where you're really concerned about always keeping the player engaged, there is certainly a place for it if you're talking about puzzle games. I will play games on my phone that are puzzle game related, and I will sit and stare at my phone without touching the screen for 10 minutes. So in terms of the anticipatory play, where what am I going to do next, or what's going to happen next, I think that's very easy to do, and all these lessons still apply. Because you still have that sense of like, oh, I'm actively engaged in the problem. I think what's harder is the sense of what does this mean, the interpretation, and in that case, I think that probably if somebody's going to free to play, they're less interested in that. I think for a smaller game, you're probably if you're doing an interpretive experience, you're probably asking for people to pay up front for it. You're not asking them to constantly do these small little actions. So I would be fascinated to try to design a free-to-play game that relied a lot on interpretive, non-interactive play. I think that's an incredible challenge, but it certainly makes it much harder because you just raise the chance that people will say, "I'm not into this. I'm not willing to play this game. I'm just going to walk away."
Thanks.
Sure.
So a great talk, and talk on a topic that's very dear to my heart because I'm trying to incorporate a lot of these things like non-interactive play, or what I would like to say, downtimes when the player can think. But you have brought two examples that I think are very on different sides of the spectrum. One being games like horror games, or Rainbow Six, when there's a corridor or some other place where the player waits, but what he does or what they do is they wait for another interaction and they are brainstorming another interaction. And you also brought walking simulators where there is really not, the payoff isn't coming, right? You are not brainstorming the game. You might be thinking about what is said to you, the story that is presented, but you are not thinking about the next interaction. So would you make that distinction between these two types of downtime, or would you like to have another argument to merge these two types of downtime?
I think they're definitely different, and they have different textures to them. And again, I think it comes down to the willingness of the player to engage. I think that if you are really into a walking simulator and really trying to understand the significance of everything, so I've worked on Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, and trying to understand the entire dynamic within the town and understanding how all these different story fragments fit together and trying to put them together, that has a very puzzly quality. There's a sense of trying to work through all the possibilities and ramifications that's very similar to the feeling that you get when you work through a puzzle in Portal. But it requires it's much more player directed. It's something that the player has to want to do. There's no way within Rapture to say, oh, you didn't figure out that these two characters were in love with each other, so you don't get to progress. Whereas in a puzzle game, it's very clearly stated, if you don't figure out where to place the portals, you don't get to progress. And so I think that the difference comes down to the player's own attitude towards the game. I think that all of these require that the interpretive aspect of non-interactive play requires much more on a willing player, someone who wants to go there. If you have a willing player who wants to ask those sorts of questions, that's when I find that they collapse into very similar sort of play spaces. If you have if you have a player who is unwilling or is not interested in that aspect of the game, that's where they seem so far apart. And so There's a whole lot of other things that we could talk about like, how do you, what sort of player model do you use? What assumptions do you make about a player? In general, we tend to ignore the player when we're doing game design, and one of the big challenges with non-interactive play is that you have to have a much more concrete model of who the player is and what their expectations are. That because you're not setting up winning conditions that are external, you're requiring the player themselves to supply them. And so if the player is not interested in figuring out the story, if the player is not interested in assigning meaning to what the experience was, then it all falls flat. So I find that the principles help unify, but they also, it all completely breaks if the player isn't willing. Does that answer your question?
Yes, okay, thanks.
Sure. I think that may be it then, if there's nobody else. Thank you very much. And if you want to talk to me, I'll still be up here.
Thank you very much. Mr. Brian Upton.